Addiction. Addiction is a huge problem in this country. What if there was a better way to treat addiction? Would you be interested in hearing about how we're approaching addiction and some new ways that we're seeing treatments that are working much more effectively? I think there is a better way. So I want to talk a little bit about addiction. We all know what addiction is. Addiction is such a huge problem in this country now. It used to seem like it was a certain group or class of people that would get addiction or families would be affected by it. But we're now seeing it in every class, every race, every religion. Everybody's dealing with it. And it's a huge problem. Just take a look at the opioid epidemic. We're seeing almost 70,000 people die every year because of drug overdoses. Just think about that, 70,000 people. You could fill up a football stadium, and those are the people that are just dying from it, let alone suffering with it. You know, we look at 9/11 and we lost 3,000 people in 9/11. This is almost like 25 9/11s every year. Could you imagine if we had something like that every 2 weeks, a 9/11 attack? Right? We would do something about it. The problem that I see is that we're running out the same old tired treatment to deal with addiction. And I know there's been a lot of help provided to people from AA and NA, and these groups are all very well intentioned. Everybody is trying to help and solve the problem. However, I think there's another way. I think there's a better way. The issue that I have is that the way we're treating people who have an addiction is we're treating them like there's something wrong with them. If you know anybody who's ever been in addiction and they show up at a hospital, they're treated differently. And they'll tell you that. Immediately they look at them, and again, it's because of the way we think about addiction. We're seeing addiction, if you ask most people, they'll tell you that addiction is a weakness. It's a flaw. It's a character issue. It's a moral issue. Well, I don't actually see it that way. I see it actually quite differently. Now, what's really interesting is if you knew who I was and you knew my background, I've never had a drop of alcohol in my life, never even once, never touched a drug in my life. And yet I'm helping people who have been in addiction, currently working with a girl that's been in addiction for 17 years, since she was 16 years old. And we're seeing remarkable changes in her because we're treating it differently. And I think the issue that I see and the problem that I see is that if you tell any human being that they're broken and they're defeated and they need to surrender and that they're going to be fighting this addiction for the rest of their lives and they'll never ever be free of it, I wouldn't tell that to my worst enemy. I think it's a mistake. Because if you tell somebody that they have no power over that, no ability to stop it, that they're going to live with it for the rest of their lives, right, that's quite defeating. And in fact, every day they have to stand up in front of a group of people and admit that they're a drug addict, they're an alcoholic. And the problem I see with that is they're fighting their spirit to fight. They're believing that they're fighting it the right way by telling people that we need to accept the fact that this is something that's overpowered you, you need to surrender to it. But I wouldn't do that with a cancer patient. Would you tell a cancer patient that they just have to accept cancer, that it's going to defeat them and they're just going to learn to live with it until it kills them? We wouldn't do that. Why are we doing that with addiction? I know we call addiction a disease, and the term disease, right, sort of has a connotation to it that it's like a cancer or it's like diabetes or something like that that's sort of out of their control. But I think we have a lot more control. I never believed that God would have ever given us something like that we can't defeat. So we're not programmed and built that way. That's not what God wanted us to be. And I believe that if we take a different approach, and the approach that we take is that I say to somebody who's in addiction, there's nothing wrong with you, and there's nothing wrong with your mind. Your mind has built up a series of glitches or error messages that are interfering with your ability to be your true self and who you are. And I've done a lot of stuff working with people who have had trauma, and we sort of take that same approach. But the approach that we're taking with this is that we actually have two issues, and sometimes a third issue. But most people who are in addiction, from my experience, have had emotional trauma or emotional experiences in their life that they're trying to get away from pain. And so that is, to me, the vast majority. The other thing that we have is that people who are actually physically. So we have emotional pain and then we have physical pain. I'm sure you probably know somebody. This is such a big problem now in this country. It's hard to not find somebody in somebody's family that you know, or even in your own family, that's not dealing with this. If you have physical pain, the solution that we're going with is medication, which obviously makes some sense if that can alleviate some short-term pain. The problem is that the prescriptions that are being given, as we all know, are very, very addictive. But where they're becoming addictive is in the mind, not the body. That's my belief. Is that the mind, the survival part of the brain that is dealing with the emotional and physical pain, is trying to get some relief. And so if you've had emotional pain in your life and you're trying to escape that pain or trying to stop that pain, that's why people will take drugs or people will drink alcohol, because it alleviates the pain. And a lot of people will say, you know, why did they get addicted? Or why did this happen to them? In most cases, they're trying to get out of pain. The mind is always trying to get into a balance. The body and mind are always trying to get to homeostasis. So if you meet people who have been traumatized maybe during their life, and they either have one of two things happening. They're going to be in a hyper-arousal state, which is that anxiety, that constant state of dread and worry, right? That's hyper-arousal. Well, if they're in hyper-arousal and they've been in that for a long, long period of time, hyper-arousal begins to feel normal. But it's not normal. We're not meant to live in that state. So they want to try to come down into a balanced state, into a homeostasis situation for the mind and the body. That's what we're always trying to calibrate to. So if you're in hyperarousal, how do you get out of hyperarousal into homeostasis? Because you're in a agitated, anxiety-ridden state with the mind, if you drink alcohol, alcohol is a depressant. So alcohol will bring you down, right, so that it goes back into a balanced state. If you've met people who drink, you'll see quite often they could be very, very agitated, full of anxiety, and then they start drinking and they relax. That's actually what they're trying to do. They're trying to relax. They're not trying to hurt themselves. They're not trying to hurt their families. They're not trying to lose their job. They're trying to get into a state of balance because that's a natural state for us to be in. So hyperarousal, you're going to take something to come down, like alcohol or a drug that's going to bring you down. If you're in hypoarousal, that's depression, right? Sadness. You want to come up. So what are they going to take? They're going to take a drug that's going to bring them up, right? To come back. So the way we look at it is if everybody's trying to get into this balanced homeostatic state, if they're in hyperarousal, they got to come down. If they're in hypo, they got to come up. And drugs and alcohol do that. And so when I say to somebody who is in an addictive state, I say, I get it. I understand what you're trying to do. It makes sense. Why does alcohol and drugs, people take alcohol and drugs? Because they work. Now, I'm not saying that the substances they're using are good for them. But you see, if you take an approach of understanding that all they're really trying to do is get into a state where they feel better. And so everybody's trying to get into that state where they feel better, and they've got to do something to try to get there. So problem number one is, why are they in the hyperarousal state or the hypoarousal state? It's generally coming from, in most experiences that I've seen, because of traumatic or disturbing events in their life that continue to keep them in this hyper or hypoarousal state. They don't know how to stop it, and they found a resource that stopped it, drugs or alcohol. It sort of makes sense. So the first thing that we do, that step number one that we've got to deal with, is that implicit, explicit memory, the declarative memory, where we store all the details about the events and experiences in our life. Once we get those addressed and we get those resolved, and the mind no longer is using that as its filter to filter its life's experiences, then the person goes into that balanced state, which is what they were trying to do. So if we can do that naturally, doesn't that seem like a much better way to do it? To naturally bring them into that homeostasis, that balanced, centered, peaceful state. And we're proving that we can do that without drugs, just basically allowing the mind to reset. And so that's issue number one, is getting the mind to reset the way it is being viewing and experiencing all these things over and over again. So now the second issue that we have to work on, which is really where the biggest issue is with addiction, is because they took a particular substance for an extended period of time, the other part of the memory, we have that explicit declarative memory where we store tremendous detail. The other part of the memory that we're working on is basically the part of the memory that uses programming. So we basically are working with procedural memory that learns through repetition. It's the same way an animal learns. It learns through repetition and procedure. And that procedure builds a code. So what I tell people who are in addiction is that if you have had emotional or physical pain and you started using a substance that brought you relief for that pain, because you repeated it enough times, the procedural part of your brain, the survival part of your brain, which is designed to program and code what it believes is in your best interest, it will code the substance that you're using as a resource to feel better. Now, so doesn't this make a lot more sense? If somebody has had the emotional pain, they take a drug, they feel better, but then every day they keep taking that drug, what are they teaching the procedural part of the mind? That this substance has something to do with survival. And that's why they have such a hard time getting out of it. Because if the brain has been programmed to use a resource for survival, and then somebody tries to take that resource away, how easy is it going to want to give that up? It's not going to want to give it up. You could have the most loving, beautiful dog in your home, and you feed that dog a big, juicy bone with lots of meat on it. And then you reach over to try to take that bone away from the dog. What's going to happen? The best dogs, the kindest dogs, will bite you because you threatened its survival. You see, an animal doesn't know, no more than our procedural part of the brain knows, everything is happening now. So if something is attacking that, it's going to respond as a threat. It's an instinct. And so just like the dog doesn't want to give up the bone because it thinks this is what I have now and I need to survive now, this bone, this meat on it is important to my survival. You try to take that bone away, I'm going to fight you, even if your dog has never shown that before. The human brain does the same thing. So the person in addiction has built a code, right? A pattern, what we call a behavior, a habit, that this substance and my survival are connected. And so they try to get people to stop. Why can't they stop? Because the survival brain doesn't want to give it up. So the approach, which I believe is a much better approach, is to be able to say, you've had some pain, whether it's emotional or physical, right? Let's get that resolved. Let's get you out of pain, whether that's a physical pain or an emotional pain. And then let's get a new code built that this substance is not connected to your survival. And then the person would be able to stop it because the mind will allow it if it has a replacement resource. Does that make sense? And that's how we're treating it. And that's why we're getting a lot of success. So as an example, I had a young lady who came in and she had been on heroin for 7 years and been seeing a therapist for 7 years. And so when she came in to sit down with me, she said to me, I told my therapist I was coming to see you. And he told me to be honest with you and upfront and let you know that I have self-destructive behavior. And so I looked at her and said something to her she'd never heard before. I said, really? What would make you think you're self-destructive? And she looked at me sort of surprised and said, I'm sticking a needle with heroin in my arm. Wouldn't you call that self-destructive? And I said something very surprising to her. I said, no, I don't think you're self-destructive. I think you were trying to feel better. And I'll bet you when you stuck the needle in your arm, you felt better. And she smiled, she goes, yeah, I did. I said, that's what you were trying to do. If you wanted to self-destruct, you could have done that. You would have done that somewhere, maybe another way. So self-destruction wasn't what you were trying to do. It was trying to feel better. Now, the issue is that the substance that you were using is destructive, but you're not destructive. That's God's message, right? People aren't trying to self-destruct. They're trying to feel better. They've just gotten lost. They've gotten away from their center. They've gotten away from their energy and their light, and they're lost. They need help. They need to be brought back into that balanced state. And so we have to do that with getting the mind reset and then creating a new way of doing things. That's the approach that we're taking with addiction. It's completely different than probably what you've heard before, but I like it better because we're treating people who are in addiction with respect, and they deserve the respect. They need to be brought back into that balanced state so they can be centered, they can be present, they can be with God and understand who they are and what their life's purpose is. And that's my message about addiction. I hope you liked it. I look forward to talking to you again. Take care.